So there we go. We are being recorded. All right, so let me go into my positive psychology information here for you. And I'll share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see my first slide there. Oops, which of course I'm in the wrong one, but now you can see my positive psychology slide. Okay, great. Again, this is not all of chapter 1. This is just a little piece I picked out because I had studied positive psychology a few years ago, and I'm a big fan of Dr. Seligman's work from the University of Pennsylvania. So I just have an interest in this one. That was one of the things I was happy to see in our textbook, that not that Skip didn't do this, but I think these authors do it a little more. They have some more recent common areas of that people are talking about in the book. So I was happy to see that things like positive psychology and resilience are in this book. So first of all, my first slide here is from the PowerPoints that come with our book. So if you haven't discovered those yet, I did put them in our shared Google folders, which at the end of this one, I'm going to remind everyone of how to get there. But basically, you go onto Macmillan's website, not Launchpad. I mean, these are in Launchpad, but you can get just a download of the slides, the PowerPoint slides on Macmillan's website. And so I downloaded them and saved them in the shared Google folder, both 100 and 102. So again, this first one is just from the book, and it's their representation of positive psychology with self-efficacy, resilience, hope, and personal responsibility. So then their definition of self-efficacy was our belief in our ability to do the tasks necessary to achieve our goals. And I was sort of thinking of this in terms of students, to say to students, actual goal setting and how to do that will be covered in chapter 3. But before we even get there, we have to have this idea of self-efficacy, that we are capable of achieving goals. So this idea of an instructional activity I included here is something I've been thinking about, especially since we went remote. Oh, and again, it reminds me, does everyone know about the trainings that are happening on Wednesday mornings? Through CDI. I think they're being recorded as well. But the last Wednesday was lessons learned. So it was a faculty panel. If you didn't get to attend, it was a faculty panel who talked about good, bad, ugly, like what did they learn? And one of the themes I noticed last Wednesday that kept coming up was the idea of making connections with students and trying to really keep students connected to us as faculty, to the course. How can we do that? So since last Wednesday and preparing for today, I've been thinking about that, especially if we start remote. You know, in the spring, if you were teaching face-to-face, we at least started and we had that relationship, that connection. And then I feel like, yes, it was really, really challenging for many of our students to switch, but they knew us, they trusted us, they did feel connected to us. If we start remote in the fall, I'm worried about that connection. So when I was thinking about the self-efficacy idea, I was thinking, like, if we're gonna be remote, how to establish, there goes my screen, how to establish that connection. Okay, I'm back. See, you don't see anything, right? You still just see what's on the screen, and I see nothing. It goes away. So anyway, I'm thinking about that connection. So and I'm sure many of you do this too, probably all of you, I have a little questionnaire in the beginning of the course, I used to use it for sort of demographic information. This is where I'd always get their most up-to-date phone number. I would ask questions about, you know, is it your first semester? Have you taken other courses? How many semesters have you been at other colleges? That type of thing, which I'm still interested in that information, but I'm thinking now, how can I use this little questionnaire as a way to start that connection, that establishing that connection? So when I was thinking about self-efficacy, I'm thinking, let me put that, especially since this is in chapter 1, let me put that on my questionnaire. Getting the students' views about their abilities, their belief in their abilities, about academics and college in general. So then I learn about them that way. But then what I'd like to do is bring that back for our first set of individual meetings to say, here's what you were thinking in the beginning of the semester. Where are you now? What's your belief about your abilities now? Up, down, same? Where do you see yourself? A little reflection. So those of you who've been around a long time know this, but if you're just starting to teach with us, you know, we have all those materials in the master course and now the Google folders, the share folders, and we have a meeting preparation exercise. But that exercise is not necessarily a mandated tool. We want students to prepare for the meeting. So we want our faculty to do something to get students to reflect and prepare for that meeting. So that exercise has always been in there for faculty to use, if you wish. The midterm one talks about midterm grades and writing a goal, and the end one sort of talks about like preparing for the future and finishing the course. So I would urge everyone to feel free to adapt that preparation exercise. And I know people do. I know people do. It's a Word document, so you can download it, change it, adapt it. And so here's what I'm thinking, that I'm gonna go back to some of those questions I asked in that questionnaire and have this reflection on self-efficacy. That's my idea for that one. Another part of their positive psychology is resilience. And I'm sure that most of you, if not all, have heard about Angela Duckworth and grit. There are some detractors for Angela's theory. So I've sort of been thinking about that, but I do think it's worth looking at and asking students to think about. So Angela does a TED Talk. It's not too long. I want to say maybe around 12 minutes or so. And so I have the link here. Oh, and that reminds me too, if you have prepared something like this for today, if you wouldn't mind sharing with that with me afterwards, I'll put these in our FYS resources shell under our professional development category. If you wouldn't mind sharing afterwards. So anyway, we have the link here for the TED Talk. Like I said, it's about 12 minutes, and Angela Duckworth talks about her background and how she moved from the business world into teaching and what she discovered with her students, and this idea of grit, like grit being a quality that if someone has it, that quality can allow us to rise above our background and our circumstances to move forward. She developed a grit scale. She works with Dr. Seligman, or she did work with Dr. Seligman at University of Pennsylvania. And he was involved with her when she was doing this research in her doctoral program. And so they developed a grit scale. It's very short, but the grit scale has been given to thousands and thousands, tens of people now. And they've sort of refined their research based on the results of this grit scale. And it's open source, so you can give it to your students and see about their scores. And then my instructional activity idea is to just do a little 1-minute paper. So if you have your students watch the TED Talk, and take the grit scale, then a little 1-minute paper with 3 questions. What is one important point you took away from the TED Talk? What was your score on the grit scale? And then here's this little part about some of the critics of this theory. Is there anything missing from this theory in the student's view, from the student's view or from the student's experience? Because a little bit of criticism has been received about this theory that no matter how gritty someone is, if they really don't even have the basics for successful human life, like food, shelter, safety, it doesn't matter how gritty they are, they're not gonna move forward. And Angela doesn't necessarily address this part of it. So I'm curious as to what students will think, because we know that some of our students are in some really negative situations. So I'm thinking, like, if they watch this and they look at their own lives, will they see that point? Will they say, it doesn't matter how gritty I am because I have nowhere to sleep tonight, kind of thing? So that's an idea for resilience. And then I just have a picture of Angela's book. If you haven't read it, I do recommend it. It's easily readable. It's written for a layperson and it's pretty short too. So I'd recommend that. I'm sure we have it in our library. I didn't check, but I bet we do. Okay, and then the next part of the theory in our book is hope.
Heather, can I ask you a question about
Yeah,
the grit
yeah.
piece?
Yes.
So what would your, I'm thinking through this, and what would your recommendation be if you have a student take the grit scale and score super low? Do we think that that might, like, uh-oh, I'm not prepared for this at all, and this is right in the beginning of the class, their scores on the ACEs are maybe low, and then their score on this is low. Do we have that possibility of maybe them saying, you know, I'm not cut out for this?
That is a good point. The way the grit scale is done, it's sort of like, I wish I had the book with me, but it's at the office, of course. The way the grit scale is done, it's sort of, it doesn't say like you're bad. If your score is really low, it doesn't say that's really bad.
Right.
It's phrased in terms of, okay, here's an area for improvement. So I think you're right, Christy, though, like if you would use this in your class, you would want to have a setup. You'd want to have some background and a setup of, okay, if your score is low, let's look at how we can improve your sense of resilience.
Because Heather, I think that the in the Skip Downing, that pre-assessment, I mean, it does the same thing because it, I mean, on a different level, but you know, it'll tell students that they're low and like believing in themselves or this and that. And sometimes you'll have students that are like freaked out, you know, that they have low scores. But yeah, I think just trying to bring that around of that's okay because we all have things to work on, but how can we improve that kind of?
Right, because this could be a double low. They could score low on the ACEs and then low on this. That's but I think you're right in talking about it out loud, that if you set it up correctly before they take it, don't give it to them blind.
Right. That's true with any of these things. I think we should have a setup. Just a side note, I don't want to get off topic. When I was at the first year experience conference back in February, I actually got to have dinner with 2 of our authors of the new book. And it was great because it was supposed to be like 8 or 10 faculty members having dinner with them. And I was the only one who showed up. So it was a little awkward at first, actually, but then I had them like to myself. And I talked about that ACEs assessment. And I said, do you have to make the red red? Like, those of you who've looked at it already, the negative scores, the lower scores are red, the medium scores are yellow, and the good scores, the high scores are green. And I said, if someone gets really big red lines, like, I don't, you know, that's not going to be positive. And they said the same thing that I just said. Well, you have to set it up and you have to explain it's areas for progress, but they did say, we will look at changing that red to another color. So I said, yes, please, like orange or something other than red. And they seriously said they would look at changing that color. So, okay, that was an aside. But yes, I think, Christy, you're right. You just have to have a little setup with this. And just the idea that these are all areas that we're going to work on in this class. So if you have red lines in ACEs, or if your grit score is a little lower, the good news is we're going to talk about strategies in this class to be able to improve those scores. Yeah, I forgot to say in the beginning, as we're presenting and talking, everyone should feel free to ask questions. It's not formal today, so jump in. Okay, so now Hope, and I'm gonna dig out some more stuff for everyone on this one, because a couple years ago we had a site symposium where the keynote speaker was about hope. And of course, all of my stuff's at the office, so I couldn't find that before today. I couldn't get it for you before today. But I'm going to dig up that stuff because it was really good. I remember it was at York, and the keynote was about hope. And it's a woman who's written a book and done research, and I think she's kind of famous. I forget her name, but like I want to pull that stuff out for everyone. And I remember this specifically because Shelley Blanchette and I were doing a workshop. We agreed to do a workshop for that site symposium about hope when we didn't even know that was the speaker. And she came to our workshop then because she was first. And then she came to our workshop in the afternoon, and we're like, oh my gosh. But we were open about it. We're like, okay, our keynote speaker is sitting in the back of the room, and we didn't even know this was our topic for today. And she said at the end, she's like, no, it was good. It was good. So anyway, I'm going to try to dig up that stuff from that speaker and put that in our resources shell as well. Because hope, and some of you may be aware of this, hope is like the new buzzword. Like people are really researching and looking at hope, and it kind of goes along with all of this stuff. In fact, one of the people who's really, and again, I forget her name, but a different person who's really big with hope right now, she's actually kind of writing it in response to Angela Duckworth and the grit scale. So that idea that no matter how gritty you are, if you don't have hope, you're not going to become more gritty. So this hope person is writing about that. So again, I'm so excited that these concepts are in our book, and we can like take just a little tiny chapter of little part of chapter 1, but if we want, we can take this and like run with it. Okay, so our textbook actually talks about willpower and way power. They quote a person named Charles Snyder, and they explain willpower and way power in terms of hope, the feeling that we can achieve our goals and that events will turn out well. So again, my instructional activity idea was just a little exercise, little thinking exercise, because they're saying willpower and way power. Willpower is your level of mental energy to press forward to achieve a positive outcome. So I'm asking students to think about what's their willpower score. And then way power is resources, plans, and skills, how we're going to make this happen. So same thing, it's a little hard to see on my slide here. On my exercise, I would do it differently, but I would say, okay, resources for us means how comfortable are you asking for help as a student? Plans, how much time, for example, how much time do you have for schoolwork each week? And skills, what are your academic skills in the classes you have this semester? So what's your level of willpower and way power? And then again, this is something I'm thinking about bringing back into those individual meetings. Like if we do this in the beginning, remember you scored yourself only a 2 and a 3, and now we're at midterm. Where would you score yourself with willpower and way power? So something to, again, connect to those meetings. And then finally, the last part of it was in chapter 1 was personal responsibility, which of course we're very familiar with. And so their definition was taking charge of goals, creating plans, seeking resources. Again, I was thinking of this in terms of students. We're going to cover personal responsibility much more in chapter 3 when we talk about mindset. But here's where I think we could bring in our language of personal responsibility exercise to start getting them thinking about it. And so I want to give a shout out to Connie and Elfie for revising that exercise. If you didn't know, I guess maybe I should have known this, but we discovered this when we were revising everything this spring. The idea of the victim creator mindset is not Skip's idea. It comes from, oh, now I'm going to forget. I forget, but it's not his. Like, it existed before him and he just used it. So Connie and Elfie revised this exercise. It looks very similar, it does, but we took out the exact wording that Skip used to avoid copyright infringement. And then we did still keep a little, Elfie put a little graphic in the exercise that is from Skip, from the Downing book, and we cited it, so it does give credit to the Downing book, but it explains the concept victim creator, and then it goes through the exercise. There's a little bit more to it now. It had 2 parts before, now it has 3 parts, but it's still very brief. So again, if we are in a face-to-face class, I do this exercise in class. So, you know, I might only lecture for a little tiny bit about victim creator, and then my exercise in class is this exercise. If we're remote, what I would do is just ask students to do the exercise and put it in a Dropbox, and we'll have to talk more about this probably and what faculty are comfortable doing. But if we're remote, it's, for me, I'm going to give points for these little exercises. If we're face-to-face, it'll just be in class. But if we're remote, I'll give points because I want them to do it. And so that reminded me to put in here, just to remind everyone, like I said, about where is all this stuff now, these revised exercises and assignments. So I created shared folders for everyone teaching in the fall, 100 and 102, and sent it to you using your hack.edu email. But I think what you might have, I didn't realize, I think what you might have seen was something that just said fall 2020. And the folder itself, like the overall folder, is FS 100 required materials or FS 102 required materials. And the reason it says fall 2020 is because we had spring and now we have fall. So I think in your email, it might have just shown up as you're being shared a folder fall 2020. But that's what this is. So all of our new exercises and assignments and the PowerPoints and the instructor's manual, I put in these shared folders. And then of course we do still have the master courses, and that was in the email I sent last week, I guess, that what we did was, instead of downloading and importing a course, we are now copying the courses. So we still have the master courses, and then what I did was I made copies of the master courses and enrolled everyone who's teaching as a faculty member in the copy courses. So you have access to everything as a faculty member from the master course. And so I included instructions for how to copy the whole course. And that's what I'd recommend for someone who doesn't already have a course set up. But if you do already have a course in D2L that's set, especially if you're teaching online, for sure, with 102, you should not use the master course. You should use your setup that you have for teaching online. And then you can just copy items. You can copy components rather than the whole course. Okay. So that is the end of my part. Let me stop my part for chapter 1. So let me stop sharing and pause for any other questions or follow-up.
Hannah, timing-wise, since that's all in chapter 1, the students have to do a pre-assessment, ACES or something else, depending on the faculty member. And then you're doing like the grit. Are you giving that as an in-class? Or do you have them do as homework too? I know at the beginning of the semester, students tend to feel overwhelmed. And a part of my concern is they're having that first journal on the pre-assessment, and then resilience comes in right away, and hope comes in, and you do all of those, that they feel like over-assessed.
Yeah, I think maybe I should have explained it. I would not do all 3 of those things in week 1.
Okay.
Do them near the beginning of the course, because you're right, it's chapter 1. But I think, well, and again, I'm still thinking about this, and we need to all have conversations about this regarding campus resources and technology. I'm thinking that needs to be first in the fall, because especially if we start face-to-face and then we have the possibility of going remote, I'm going to do like everything possible with technology and resources in week 1. Who cares? I'm not even going to start the book, you know, like deal with getting students ready with the technology. Now, if we're already remote, I guess I'd still approach it the same way, really. I mean, students hopefully will have that warning if we stay remote that they're going to be using technology. But I think I'm still going to start with technology.
Yeah, they may know how to get into Zoom, but not necessarily know how to do D2L, how to upload and download, and
exactly
how to connect Hawk. If they're using Google, showing them how to connect their Hawk account to their D2L, so they can use their Google product and stuff like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's probably for me going to be week 1. Yeah. And so therefore, I think number 1, you wouldn't have to do all of these things. I'm just all into this because it's my thing. So you wouldn't have to do all of these, but if we do, I would spread them out in the like week 2, week 3. Yeah, but I'm going to focus, and that's something for everyone to know. Our planned sequence of instruction on our Form 335 has campus resources as like 5 or 6 in order. But I think that's because I know that everyone addresses it a little bit in the beginning. Everyone does. I just know you do, because you have to talk about like, where's the tutoring center? Where's the library? So people do address that a little bit. The actual topic in our plan sequence was later in the plan sequence. I'm saying just ignore that plan sequence. Like do resources, do technology in the very beginning, whether we're remote or face-to-face, because if we're face-to-face and then we have another resurgence of the virus, we're going to be out. So ignore that plan sequence and do resources and technology first, then maybe catch up with all this other stuff.
I'm taking it a little off topic for a moment, but talking about those campus resources, I had my students in the spring provide feedback on what were the favorite and least favorite activities and topics and so forth. And I have my students do the scavenger hunt as a group and doing group selfies. And I would say about 90% of my students said that was like the best thing, because they got to just interact outside of the classroom with each other, learning about the resources, going to places, but spend that time together. And so that's one of those things I'm like, I need to do that at the beginning, because that will help with that bonding early on, particularly if we then have to go to remote after, we don't know what's going to happen. So I want to encourage people to really think about that. Yes, the technology, but also figuring things out to help them connect very quickly early on, particularly if we are on campus, to use that time wisely, because we don't know how long it would be.
Right. Good thought. Okay, let me look at my list here. Oh, Christy, I think you're up because we have you for chapter 2.
I am up. Let me see if I can. I have the same glitch you do, Heather, but mine happens when I share my screen. So let's
Okay.
see if I can get mine to share. Okay, hold on one second. Okay, can you see my Google Slides?
Yep.
Okay, so my topic was goal setting, and I found that a lot of it was very similar to what we currently do, which would be the DAPS model. The biggest difference was that they use SMART goal setting instead of the DAPS model. And I'm pretty sure that most of you have kind of flip-flopped or used both. But a few thoughts that I had was in the beginning of the chapter, I noticed that they asked the students to look at their critical thinking and goal setting score on the ACEs and then think about those results. Now, they ask that for every chapter. So I don't know if we want to, if we're thinking about doing that for every chapter, if we want to pull that piece out, but I thought it was pretty powerful to say, okay, look at that, look at those scores, you know, and I don't know, even maybe incorporate those scores into the assignment so that we can even relate it back. Hey, we might need to work on your goal setting a little bit. Or for some students, it may come pretty naturally. So that was one thing I thought about incorporating into that assignment. Let's see. Okay, well, that's the topic slide. Okay, give me just a second here. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. So this can be added to the motivation lesson. So I'm kind of jumping around here. Normally when I do this, I start with the motivation lesson, do the score on the motivation, have them evaluate each of their classes, and then I usually have them write their goal based on the class where they have the lowest score. I pull that. I think most of us do that. And I think we can kind of keep that, but incorporate into that piece that score from the ACEs. So let's kind of pull that all together to just keep them reflecting back on that ACEs score. Then they have a process to set goals, which I thought was interesting. And when they say gather information in the book, you know, what are some things that you need to think about when you're goal setting? Have you had experience in goal setting? What's your thought process about this whole thing? And I'm switching to the page here. Some things they might write down when they're gathering information is sometimes it's hard for me to manage my time. I need a regular schedule. I have a lot of distractions at home. Maybe I have 5 children and I work nights. You know, a lot of the stories that we hear from our students. So I think they need to look at that first. Look at their motivation score, gather a lot of information about them, and then set the SMART goals. And in the text, I didn't have an image of it, but it's on page 29 if you have the text. And this runs throughout the book. It's the personal success plan. And this is, you know, these 5 questions follow that. And in there where it has your SMART goal, it actually has the check boxes, which we never really used for DAPS. And when I saw this, I thought, oh, that might make it a little bit easier for students if they could, you know, write the goal and then actually physically check off in the boxes. Is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? And go through that. And then they can
Christy,
yeah.
sorry for interrupting, but you'll be happy to know we included checkboxes on the goal setting side.
Awesome. Okay, there you go. It's the little things, right, that can make us happy. And then the action plan, which is what we've always had, we did what are 5 steps you can take. With this action plan, they have them put dates in. And I thought that was really good. In order, what are you going to do? And many times we hear them say, attend class regularly, you know, some basic steps like that. But let's put dates in with that because that really aligns with SMART goal setting. Then listing their barriers, that's a big one because we know that our students have tons of barriers. So what are their barriers and what are they going to do, You know, what are they going to do to get past those barriers? And then what are my actions going to be? So what can I do about it? So I thought that that part was really interesting. Um, in the book, when we're teaching the SMART goal setting, there are examples on page 23 in the book. And what I thought was either use these or come up with, you know, some where you could split them into groups, whether if it was in person, physical groups, or if we're remote, you can put them in some breakout rooms and give them a week goal and have them use the SMART criteria and convert it to a SMART goal and then discuss why it was weak and what they did to convert it. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And maybe some of you do that, and I just hadn't thought of doing it in reverse. I usually call a student up to the front of the class and write a goal, and it's usually, you know, do good in school. And then we go through the checklist and convert it. This is just a different way to go around that. That could possibly be a really good match for remote learning, to take kind of weak goals, give them the weak goals and have them convert it. And it could give them the confidence too of being able to actually do that.
I had a quick question because I have like, this is where I struggle, and I'm sure you guys have good suggestions. The specific and the measurable always seem the same to me. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was the specific of the DAPS. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, specific and measurable seem the same to me, so I don't know what like I'm missing there.
I normally have the most questions on specific and dated. Those are the two that I focus on, and they'll say get good grades. And I'll say, well, what does good mean? A C is good for Heather, but Connie wants A's. What does good mean? And then we'll convert it to whatever their good is, knowing that all the goods are different.
But I guess what I'm saying is, I feel like if you said, I want to get good grades, it's not measurable because what does good really mean? But it's also not specific because what does good really mean? Like, to me, specific and measurable seem like the same thing. So I don't know how, does everybody get what I'm saying? Like, I get confused about how to explain that to students because they seem like the exact same concept. They just wanted to come up with an acronym, SMART, so they came up with S and M, but S and M like are the same thing to me, I feel like. And that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if I was like, if anybody else saw it different or like.
I can tell you how I explain the difference. I tell the students, yes, they're very, very similar. But for me, measurable means there should be a number in the goal. So specific, okay, we're talking about grades. Grades in all of my classes, grades in math, grades in English, grades in history. But then measurable, the M, I say, I want to see a number. I want to see a percentage. I want to see a number. In fact, even with DAPS, measurable wasn't one of the acronym letters, but I say I put numbers. For me, measurable means numbers.
Yeah, that helps. That helps a little bit. Like, just put, I wrote that down. But they are similar because they both, the specific and the measurable would be the S, and DAPS, they would combine that into one. That's.
And then finally, what I think is a good idea, which this was the first slide I showed, it should have been the last one, is having them complete that personal success plan. There's a blank one on page 31. There's a sample one on page 29. But again, this is in every chapter for all the lessons. So I think it's a good fit for goal setting. I'm assuming, I did not connect the book yet to my class, but I'm assuming when you do that, we can kind of download this sheet and then have them fill it out right in this sheet. I think it just kind of enhances the goal setting. So that was it.
Okay, let me see. Oh, it's me. I was just saying, who's up next? It's me with chapter 3. Now, I promise I won't talk as long this time. I said we should only pick one chapter each, but then what I did when I was thinking of, okay, chapter 3, this again is just me being the discipline lead to make sure people know how things have been revised to reflect the new book. So I'm not going to talk as long this time. So chapter 3, motivation, decision-making, and personal responsibility, all very similar to what we already know and what we already do. But I'll show you, I do have a couple slides, a few slides, and just to make sure people know how things have been revised to match the new book. Well, and talking about matching the new book, that was also one of the reasons I like this book, is we are talking about the same concepts and we're achieving our learning outcomes. But to me, at least, it doesn't seem like we have as much very specific copyrighted material from the book to address our learning outcomes. The book is more general, which I liked, because if we switch the book again in 5 years or whatever, 3 years, 5 years, I found this time that we were able to be more general about the concepts. And if, bless you, Jill, if we switch again, I think next time we won't have to make as many changes to our assignments as we did this time. Okay, so let me get into, I'm going to share again and get into my slides here. Okay. So I have from the instructor slides, the slide from the book about motivation, self-efficacy that we talked about back in chapter 1, relevance and attitude. And now here's something the curriculum committee discovered as well. Again, maybe some people already knew this, I didn't, but the curriculum committee discovered that the V times E equals M also was not Skip's concept. It was not. It's from actually a kind of really old theory started by someone named Broom and then continued by a researcher named Eccles, who has been joined by other people. But the theory, this expectancy value theory, has been around. Broom, I think, brought it up in the 1950s. And it was from a business perspective, and then Eccles is from an education perspective. So I think it was Elfie and Allison Valentine who researched this and found that, yay, we can still use the same information we've been using because it wasn't Skip's, it's this other widely known theory. Okay, so in the book, they talk about self-efficacy and attitude, in our new book, I should say. And to me, that goes with the expectancy part of the theory. The self-efficacy belief that we have the ability, and our attitude, our approach to whether I believe I can do this. So then in the new textbook, they say relevance, which to me is the value. So how much we value the outcome, whether it's relevant in our lives. Okay, so that's how I'm connecting it at least. And this part is right from the original theory put forth by Broom, and it explains the whole multiplication thing. Like I would always explain that to my students, and I would say, why do you think it's not addition? Why is it multiplication? And it's because of the zero factor. It's if one of them's 0, it's going to be 0. And usually the students would get that. Sometimes I'd have to explain it. But I would always ask the students that, not even realizing that that was actually part of the theory. That was why it was multiplication and not like addition. And so our motivation exercise, I know Christy, you just mentioned that we still have the motivation exercise is still set up the same way, with having them figure out their scores in their classes, and then the goal with the lowest score at the class that has the lowest score. And we put this theory, we use the Eccles version. I think Alfie used the Eccles version. We put this theory in the exercise. So it sort of explains this is where the theory and concept comes from. And now the students are going to do the exercise. Okay. And of course, we cited it, we gave credit. Then our decision-making model, does change a little bit. We did have to get rid of the wise choice process because that was Skip. That was Skip's actual like words and his concept, wise choice process. So this is the model now that's used in the new book, 8 steps, very similar, very similar. They just broke out a couple of the steps and they added this step 2 right here that we didn't really have something like this in the wise choice process. So the decision, knowing yourself, and again, Christy just mentioned this in the goal setting concept, the options, gathering information about each option. Here's where they broke out like 2 of the previous wise choice process steps. So gathering information and evaluating, selecting, and then developing and implementing their action plan and evaluate. Okay, so it's 8 instead of 6 with the addition of know yourself and the breakout here 4 and 5. Okay. So we did revise the decision-making assignment to reflect the book. That is one thing that's still definitely tied to the book. But like I said, it removes the words wise choice process and it's just called decision-making now. So here's what I've always done with the previous one, and I'm thinking of doing the same thing, where I would have a slide or the whiteboard if we're in person, and I would ask for a volunteer to give a life situation. And then basically just the whole class, we'd fill in the steps of the process. Now, one thing that I am going to continue that Skip specifically talked about in his process was when you're generating those options, to try not to evaluate them yet, just brainstorm. You know, Skip talked about brainstorming, walking away, and then coming back. So I'm going to say the same thing to the students. And the reason I like to do this as a group in the class is because they always come up with positive options. They do, whatever the situation is. And what I have here on the slide is if you don't have a talkative class or they're not energetic that day, have a situation in your mind, in your pocket that you could put. Anyway, when we get to the part about the steps, they always generate positive sounding steps, or I'm sorry, options, choices. So then I'll say, well, what could be some negative choices? And it takes them a while sometimes to think about that. But I say, this idea of just brainstorming, there could be some options and choices that may not sound so positive when you first think about it, but you're not judging it yet. You're not evaluating it yet. Okay. So I'm still going to try to do the same thing, ask them to think of negative choices or potentially negative choices. And that just helps sometimes because it makes them laugh and it generates a little bit of camaraderie there. Because someone will say something, they'll finally get what I'm asking, and someone will say something that could be negative, and everyone's like, oh, no. And I say, wait, I'm writing that down. Because it's the idea of we're just brainstorming and we are not evaluating yet. So I'm still hoping to do it that same way. If we're remote, then I might do breakout rooms with small groups or something like that. But just having everyone go through the process together to fill it in together. Now here's another idea for this activity, a thinking question for discussion. I don't know that Skip ever actually said this, but in this book, in the new textbook, it says, and I didn't look up the page, maybe I can find it quickly. It says something like, if you get to the end and you evaluate and it didn't work, you start the process over. But I don't think that's true. I always ask my students, if you get to the end and you realize when you evaluate that this really didn't work, where do you go? Do you have to start over? No. You've already done a whole bunch of work in step 3 to come up with options. You already did a whole bunch of work in the new model in steps 4 and 5 to evaluate those options. So no, you don't have to start over. And sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't, and I explain it. But yeah, so that's a thinking question. And in this case now, I can say, and sometimes I like to say this, and it makes them, it makes their eyes widen. Sometimes I say, I don't agree with the textbook author here. I don't agree. They say you have to start over. Do you? And they're like, and it gets them thinking. And so then the last one I have listed here is the actual decision-making assignment, which again, it's very similar, but it just now follows the model in the book and is similar to our wise choice process assignment. But what I had always done in the past is I actually asked them to start a rough draft of the assignment in class. I would ask them to do steps 1, 2, and 3. I think now with this new model, it's actually 4, down through step 4. But I want them to actually think of the issue and start in class making their list of options. Because I don't know about you, but I found some of our students do have a hard time thinking of options. It may be because they aren't used to having options in their lives, and it may be hard for them to brainstorm and think. So I actually physically walk around as they're working on it, and if I see someone is stuck with options, I give some suggestions, I give some feedback, just like right there in class. I started doing this after a student taught me this idea years ago. And he said something like, he was just sitting. He was a good student. He was always very active, participating, but he was just sitting. His pen wasn't even in his hand. He wasn't even writing. And I went over to him and I said, so what's going on? You know, do you not understand the instructions? Do you need some help? And he said, in my life, I can only think one day at a time. I don't know what you mean about options. I don't have options. I think about my life one day at a time. And I knew he had a very, very challenging life. So that kind of took me back to say, oh, like I'm assuming everyone can think of all these wonderful options and ideas and the future. He said, I take one day at a time. So it made me think, and so I did have to stop. Like I didn't have a ready answer for him right at that moment. So I said, let me think about this for a moment. And then I did go back to him in the same class and said, okay, thinking about your life today with this particular issue that you're thinking about, what would you like it, how would you like it to be different? And that's what allowed him to start thinking about some options. But he taught me that. He said, I don't have options. Again, that's why I do this now in class where I kind of go around and give sometimes I'll be silly and they'll say, oh, and I'll say, we're not judging it yet. We're not evaluating it yet. And then they'll write it down as an option. So that's what I do with this one. If we're remote, that would definitely be harder. But maybe I would do like breakout rooms and say, give each other suggestions if you're comfortable sharing the issue that you're thinking about. Maybe you can give each other options if you get stuck on your list of options. Then they do talk about personal responsibility again, which is great because it still follows what we have in our learning outcomes. But in this case, after the part in chapter 1, in chapter 3, when they're really talking about personal responsibility, they're talking about fixed and growth mindset from Carol Dweck, which Skip also had in On Course, but I never understood. He had that in chapter 8, I guess because he was talking, or I'm sorry, chapter 7, because he was talking about it in terms of lifelong learning. But when we got to that, I would always ask my students, what does this sound like? I mean, the word is the same, mindset. What does this remind you of? And they would get it. They would say victim and creator. So now this book, you know, pulls it together, and they use the fixed and growth to talk about personal responsibility specific to learning and college and academics. But I think we can still explain it in terms of mindset in general. So Carol Dweck does have a free little mindset quiz, if you weren't aware of that. And it is free, you're allowed to use it, but it's not electronic, it's PDF. So I guess she still has like a little bit of control over it in that way. So I put it in the resources shell, the FYS course resources shell. It's a PDF document, and it's very brief, just a little brief assessment, and then it gives students scores about where they are in that continuum of fixed and growth. And so I always have my students do this. So I'll ask them to do the quiz, and then again, process with a little 1-minute paper with 3 questions. So what was your score? Do you agree? Why or why not? And the sort of the lower end is 0 to 16. So how could you move towards a growth mindset if students scored that 0 to 16? And again, just like we talked about before in Christy's question, I always explain, it's not good and bad. It's growth and fixed, and there's a continuum. In fact, I always give an explanation on this one that usually makes them laugh. I talk about gaming, video games. My husband is a big gamer with racing games, because we're car people and we're amateur auto racers. So he's a big gamer with that. And he always wants me to play with him. And I suck. I hate it. So I give that example to my students. I say, I'm at a 0 with gaming. I'm in a fixed mindset. I crash all the time. I don't believe that any amount of practice is going to make me any better. But I just don't care. I just don't care. And they laugh and they laugh. And I say, but there's a difference. If I cared, if I wanted to get better and I wanted to improve, I believe I could do it. I would practice, I would read about it, I would watch videos. I have that growth mindset that I believe I can do it, but I don't care. And then they laugh. So I always give that example here, that it's not good and bad, it's growth and fix. And then I just have a picture of her book. If you haven't read it, same thing. It's an easy read, it's pretty quick. And I pulled out a lot of inspirational quotes from this book. I really like this book. And in fact, there's a story about a teacher in Chicago who took one of the worst performing schools. Well, she wasn't the only one. It was her whole school adopted this idea of fixed and growth mindset. One of the worst performing schools to one of the best in the state, and nothing changed with the kids. They didn't give them like financial support or any more food or any of those like bottom levels. The students were all in their same life situations, but they taught them about fixed and growth. I think it was middle school math, I think, if I remember correctly. And they taught them about fixed and growth, and then the students just took off. So I found a lot of inspiration in this book. Oh, and there was one about relationships, which I love. I say all the time from this book. It said, they didn't live happily ever after. They worked happily ever after. So I love that one from this. Okay, so let me stop sharing and pause there for any thoughts or follow up on that one. Okay, then let me see. I think we are up to Elfie for chapter 4.
All right, so let me go ahead and bring up my screen and see if I can get everything up and going here. Actually, when it comes to PowerPoint, because Heather, you were talking about PDFs, I go back and forth because I like to use PowerPoints when it's just a straight PowerPoint, but when I have anything interactive, then I still use the slides. Talking about today, chapter 4 is about understanding learning. And this is always an interesting one. I remember years ago when we were talking about, what is going to be included in college success. And I remember Kathy Doherty back then was our department chair. And she had a very strong reaction about doing learning styles or have anything about learning styles in there. And we had an interesting discussion. But I do still like to talk about it and like to talk about learning. So in this one here in chapter 4, it focuses on 2 theories. It talks about a Myers-Briggs type indicator, which I think is interesting. I love MBTI for many, many reasons, because it has so many different uses and so many different ways of looking at it. I always have students tell me how much it helps them in their personal relationships and how they look at, people they interact with in a different way. And it also looks at the VARG. But what I want to focus on today is I want to sort of go through how I introduce the topic with my students. So, and since we've been sitting and talking, I want to just do something active. So something very simple. If you can just grab a piece of paper and something to write right now. Everybody have something to write with? Okay. So all I want you to do is just write down your name any way you like it. It can be your signature, it can be block letters, it can be longhand, shorthand. Doesn't matter how, just write down your name. Everybody got that done, I think? And then I want you to just switch your pen or pencil to the other side and write your name again. So, Christy's still writing? Okay. Was everybody able to write their name twice? Did you prefer one way over the other? How many of you liked the first time better? Second time? Right. So what we're talking about and what I'd like to really, emphasize about is preferences. And what are really preferences? And I always tell this story, and I'm trying to make it really quick, but my mother is 88 years old, and she's left-handed. And she was born in a time in my country where it was unacceptable to be different than the norm. So, there was a certain standard of what was acceptable. So when she went to school and she was learning to write, and she was asked to pick up the pen or pencil. As a left-hander, with what hand would you pick up the pen or pencil? With the left hand, it's her dominant hand, that's not normal. Well, it was unacceptable because it was considered abnormal. So she was told to put the pen or the pencil on the right and start writing. As soon as the teacher looked away, what would my mother do? Put her right back in her left. She's a stubborn woman too, I can say that. And so the teacher would get upset, like, no, you have to have it in the right. My mother would keep trying with the left. So eventually said, well, Katie, your left hand is sick. We're gonna have to bandage it. So they bandaged her left hand to force her to write with her right hand. And she's a stubborn woman. What was she trying to do with her bandage? She's still trying to hold it with her left hand. So eventually what they did is, it's something that you can't imagine in education nowadays, but they tied her left hand to the table to force her to write with her right hand. Now she's 88 years old. With what hand does she write? What do you think?
Does she use her right? Her right?
She still writes with her right hand. And this is something that really surprises my students. And I like to talk about preferences in many different aspects. And sometimes I will bring it back up and up again as we talk about different theories along the way. So in my career class, for example, we talk about skills. I talk about innate and natural abilities versus skills. what's your natural strengths and abilities? And it's an interesting concept because sometimes we think it's the same thing. And we don't always have the ability to do what we prefer to do. We're not able to develop skills in areas where we prefer because of the circumstances. And so talking about preferences, that just, when we can do something the way we prefer to do it, it feels more comfortable. But it doesn't mean it's the only way we're able to do that. And so I like to talk about that when it comes to learning styles, just to remind students, just because you have a preferred learning style, it's the way I feel more comfortable. It may be the way that it's more efficient and effective for me, but it's not the only way. And just like, it's great when we can use strategies that we prefer to use, we don't always are in situations where we're able to do what we prefer. And so that concept of having to be multimodal, of being able to use strategies and apply things and finding value in things that may be out of our comfort zone. And so when I talk about preferences, this is sort of my way sometimes to talk about stepping out of our comfort zone. Now, when it comes to preferences, I also like to talk about preferences when it comes to, or emphasize preferences when it comes to MBTI. When students take, the personality assessments, they oftentimes are like, okay, I don't have preferences. And so I like to bring up, and I'm going to take myself off here for a moment from sharing so you can see me. And I like to bring in food. I tend to get people's attention with food. And I'm like, okay, so I have a mint candy and I have a Reese's peanut butter cup. And I like to bring in my kids. My students tell me it makes me look more human. But I'm like, okay, so I have 2 kids. And I ask my son, do you want a mint candy or do you want a Reese's peanut butter cup? And he'll say, I want a Reese's peanut butter cup. And the next day I ask him, do you want a mint candy? Do you want a Reese's peanut butter cup? I want a Reese's peanut butter cup. And the next day, I want a Reese's peanut butter cup. It doesn't take long for me to be able to observe his preferences. Preferences is something that is observable. And it doesn't take long to figure out what's his preference. What do you think? What does he prefer?
The peanut butter.
Yeah, the peanut butter cup, right? So then I go to my daughter. I just do the same thing with my daughter. Mint candy. Next day, peanut butter cup. Next day, mint candy. Next day, mint candy. Next. So I have to observe and observe and observe and observe. So it takes my son, I have to observe him maybe 4 or 5 times. I know what his preferences are. My daughter, I'm going to have to observe a little longer. But eventually I will find out that she also has a preference, but her preference is not as strong. So let me bring back and share that screen, that some of our preferences are much stronger. That means when I go in and I look at my son, his preferences are about here. When it comes to his candy preference. My daughter's preference is about like here. She still has a preference. She still leans towards one over the other, but her preference is not as strong. And so sometimes we're much more aware of where our preferences are because they're very, very strong. And sometimes we're less aware. And this is where assessments can help us identify that and become more aware of where we actually are. So let me here clear that out again. And then I like to talk about theories. And when it comes to theories, and I'm going to, again, stop sharing my screen here for a moment, if I can figure out where it just went. Okay. So I like to bring in fruit. Oops. Okay. For this one. This is easier when it's not remote. You know, the experience. I also like to offer, with the candy too. Sometimes I forgot to say that when I do the candy thing, sometimes I ask students, which one do you prefer? And, I go around and I have candies and give away and it gets their attention. And I will have, when I use peanut butter, someone says, well, I'm allergic to peanut butter. I like it, but I'm allergic to it. And that helps them to bring that conversation around and say, yeah, sometimes we would like something, we would prefer something, but it's really not good for us. Or it's just not available for us. So again, it's a way to bring that around to the importance of also being familiar with what we're not preferring, what we don't like so much. But coming back to the apple, I find, years ago, the first time I taught career development was 22 years ago. And I was trying to figure out, students were talking about, well, we have all these theories, and I feel like I'm doing the same thing over and over again. In that class, we do assessments, and a lot of the assessments ask very similar questions, but they're using in a different way. And so didn't I just answer that? Didn't I just say that? And so I like to talk about theories, and I like to bring in an apple for that. And so I have students look at the apple, and I'll go up to a student and say, okay, can you describe the apple? And they talk about what they see. And then I'm like, okay, what do you describe the apple for me? And I get a different prescription. I look at them. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Don't we just looking at the apple too? I'm like, okay, describe the apple. and instead I get different observations. And I'm like, but we all looking at the apple. So why, who's right here? Who's giving the right description? And then I like to, just because I like to bring in the senses and everything, I will cut it up. In the classroom, I use a plastic knife, which is always funny. And I look at it, and then I have them smell it. And then I'm a student, I give them a piece, and I have them try it and describe it. And we're collecting all these different descriptions. And then we bring it back around that, yes, we're all looking at the same thing. And it's not making one description isn't more right than another description. It's not about right or wrong. We're just looking at it from a different perspective. And so when we're looking at theories, and we're, looking at, let me bring up my screen again. And we're looking at theories. In this case, we are talking about, we're talking about something a little bit more complex, and I like to draw a little self-portrait. And I always tell students, it's just because you like to do something, you don't necessarily have the skill to make it a profession. Okay, so I like to draw. So I make a little self-portrait. Okay, there. So this is me. Now that is a little bit more complex than an apple. Okay, but there's all kinds of theories that help explain me, what I do and how I am. And just like the apple, we can twist it and turn it and look at it from different perspectives. We can look at people in different ways. And so different theories look at different aspects of who we are, how we learn, how we think, how we act, what we're good at, what's important to us. There are all different kinds of theories on it. And it's not that one theory is right and another theory is wrong. They're all right and wrong. Because they're all wrong, because they're all oversimplification. None of them really explain every aspect. So when we look at Myers-Briggs type indicator, we have 16 personalities. Well, even within each type, you're going to have so many variations and so many differences that the theory doesn't account for. It's just like grit. Grit looks at one aspect, but that doesn't explain everything about it. It doesn't account for everything. It doesn't account for hope. But sometimes we oversimplify something just for us to be able to start to understand it. And they're just a way for us to access and understand ourselves a little bit better. None of them explain every aspect of us, take everything into account. And I think sometimes when you start talking about that, it helps students to say, okay, so I don't have to believe in everything. And just because I don't accept this part of it doesn't mean that there can be value. And we have that conversation that we can get value for something, even so it doesn't account for everything. And then I like to talk about it. And then I also like to take that little self-portrait to sort of go into that aspect of learning. And I talk about it. So here I am. here's this person, here's me. So what does it take if I now want to learn how to grow dahlias? My daughter loves dahlias. She loves flowers. So what does it take for me to learn how to dahlias? What are some of the things that have to happen? So, and so we talk around about it, and eventually we get to the point is that, you know, I have to learn about it, okay? So I have to take in information about how to grow dahlias. And so it's about the input. And then we talk about, you know, how do I take in information? And here we can end up, we get to the point where we talk about the bark. Okay, so how do I take in information? Because students will start talking about, well, through your eyes, and by smelling or by touching. And we talk about all the different ways that we take in information. And we talk about, you know, there are theories that talk about just the input. It's not all aspects of learning, just how we take in information. And then there are others that talk about what's going on up there in your head, about how you process and store the information. And then there are other theories that talk about the output aspect. And so, I like to put that into perspective and talk about that aspect. And then let me go ahead and clear my drawings again. And then, you know, this is no longer part of the new book. This is from Skip, where he really, you know, he has a picture of the neural network, and he talks about, there's a little bit of that in chapter 4 where he talks about the neural network, but not as much as in Skip. But I find students really like that, and it's sort of building on metacognition too. So when I always talk about this aspect, I like to talk about growth mindset at the same time. And like responsibility and then growth mindset sort of is in the middle, because it's sort of both parts and then into the learning. So it works well because growth mindset is chapter 3, and then we're going into chapter 4. And you can help making those connections between them. But I like to talk again, and I like to draw on my PowerPoints, but you know, you have these neurons, and then they're firing, and then, you know, and then they start, today I can't find my right, and then they, you know, they start dissipating again if you don't do something. And we start talking about and go into eventually talk about the model of memory. And you know, how everybody's familiar with it, but it talks about sensory memory in there. I like to spread it out a little bit more. I usually use an example of like, I'm driving into work, and do I really want to remember everything? Why do we have a short-term memory? You know, do we really want to remember every single thing that we see and smell and hear and taste? And so talking about sensory signals versus sensory, sorry, I did not clear this in here, versus sensory memory, and then going into short-term memory, long-term memory, and the importance of, like, if those neurons have to keep firing to become a permanent pathway, so it's a long-term memory. And so I always like to go from, you know, just in general, setting the stage that there's no like one right way to learn, that there are different theories, and we can learn from different things, and then go into actually a model and into the theory in itself, and explain that. And I always have students bring up examples and have that discussion and interaction with it. And then the other thing I always like to focus on, typically when I go into this is where I have my first quiz. Now, this is going to be a little bit later. I usually do this as I do responsibility, which was chapter 2 with Skip. And then I do that part, I bring in that becoming an active learner. So oftentimes this is my first real quiz. And so after the quiz, I like to talk about, you know, who's happy about their quiz results, who's not happy about their quiz results, and talk about the preparation, and talk about the important. And in the book, there is a quote by John Dewey, which lends itself right into this whole thing. Failure is instructive. That failure is only truly a mistake. It's only a bad thing if we don't learn from it. That as long as we look at everything we do as a learning opportunity, it can be of value. It can be a great thing. Sometimes we learn so much more for when things don't work out. And, you know, we talk about like the Edison light bulb, how many tries was it? And, you know, if you would have given up by the first time it didn't work out, you know, we would be sitting in the dark. And we sort of bring up examples and talk about, there are lots of cute little YouTube videos out there too that talk about, you know, all these great successes and how they're built on failures and how valuable they can be. But one thing I always like to emphasize, and now in the old book in Skip, he had this played out between before, while, after. But I always say before, during, and after. But I always bring an example of cooking. Like I said, I'm obsessed with food. But I'm trying, I do a new recipe. And so I'm baking a cake, you know, and so before I even show that, I ask students, you know, if I bake a cake, what's the first thing I have to do? And I talk about getting the ingredients or recipe or anything like that. And I'm like, okay, that's the before. So before I actually can bake, I have stuff that I have to do. And so I have to collect all the things that I need for it. And then, you know, then I actually bake it. And then I'm like, okay, so after you bake it, what do you have to do? And they're like, eat it. Okay, and so when I eat it, what else should be going on in my mind as I eat it? And eventually I can typically pull out that, you know, does it taste good? Is it the way I want it? And so I'm in the after, and I said, so if the cake is really, really sweet, what should I do next time? Should I do the same recipe the same way? And we talk about, no, you want to make adjustments. You know, you want to change the recipe, and the importance of assessing. And so I use that to introduce the importance that whenever we do something, is it a job interview? Is it, I took a quiz, a test, I got a grade back. No matter what I do, you don't want to just say, oh, I got a good grade, yay, or oh, I got a bad grade, I don't want to look at it. We have a tendency of avoidance that when something doesn't work out, we don't want to confront it, we don't want to look at it. And so I like to have a conversation about the importance, how do I learn from that? And that what I do, what worked and what did not work, should then inform how I approach it the next time, and having a conversation around that. And it's something that I bring up over and over again throughout the semester when students, like after each quiz, I'm like, okay, what you should be doing right now? You know, you know, throughout the semester to get them around in that mindset, which then connects us again. We connect that to growth mindset. You know, it's that we learn from what we're doing, you know, and we're not threatened by failure. That's, again, it brings that conversation back around to fixed mindset versus growth mindset. So how do I deal with the after if I have a fixed mindset? How do I deal with the after if I have a growth mindset? Making that connection. And I still like to talk about the processing. I know the 3 principles of deep and lasting learning are not part of this book, but I actually was talking about 2 of those even before the principles. And I always like to talk about manufacturing. You know, I have all these t-shirts I'm producing. And if I only look at, I want to do the maximum number of t-shirts, and I just focus on quantity, what's the problem with it? And then we'll talk about, yeah, well, if none, you know, all of, the, you know, I'm doing 1,000 t-shirts, but all of them, the left seam is open because I didn't watch for quality, just for quantity, I'm not going to make much money. Okay. On the other hand, if I just focus on quality and I only produce 1 t-shirt that is perfect, I'm not going to make a lot. I'm not going to have a lot of, so that importance that you both need the quality and quantity, and then bringing that into the learning environment, you know, it's not just learning more hours, or it's not just using the best strategies. You need both. And then we bring up that idea of balancing it out, that more is sometimes just more, but we're also not going for perfection. So this is where I talk about perfection versus just just producing, and then lead into that. So what does that mean with like distributed learning, and how to deal with it when you're bored, changing out the material, trying different strategies. It also all connects right back to it. So how can I increase my quality? If I think about now going back to the model of learning, how I turn short-term memory and learn long-term memory. How do I not get stuck in the short-term memory trap? How do I spend as little money as possible to get as little time as possible to get the most effect? Well, by distributing, instead of having a 6-hour session, 4 one-hour sessions I'm going to get more out of. So just more in itself isn't enough, and really talking about those concepts and connecting that. And the last thing I want to just show is 2 things if you're not familiar with it. There's a VARC assessment in the book, but there is also an online one. I actually have that as an extra credit assignment in my class. I have a VARC worksheet where they just respond. They say, this is my VARC, this is my learning style. And then these are the strategies that are great in my learning styles. And then these are multimodal strategies outside of my learning style I may want to try. And I do that right now as an extra credit assignment. I'm not sure if since it's now in the book, if I'm actually going to do that as part of an in-class assignment or not, but there is an online version. And then I always have my students now in the classroom. I have a printed version of this. It's up from Education Planner. If we're remote, where they can just sort of thinking, and in the class I have them just answer that, and then we talk about it. So what are good strategies that help you improve some of those habits? And we talk about which ones they already have, which ones they don't have, which ones they don't even think they want to do. And why do they really not want to do them, and having a conversation around them. I usually have them work in like small groups. So if we were remote, I probably would put them in breakout and talk about that with each other, and then bring it back to a larger group. But it's sort of a quick way to really think about the general things that are good for everybody to consider. All right. Any questions or anything? Let me go ahead. I need to close that and I can stop share.
Not a question, but oh.
You want to unmute yourself?
I am. Can you hear me?
Huh.
Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I can't hear you guys, so something, maybe it's on my end.
Maybe your volume is turned down. But yeah, just
Can you guys hear Heather? Okay.
and we can hear you too.
Okay, I got you again. I lost you there. So
Okay.
you lose the screen, I lose sound.
The volume. But yeah, the idea of distributed practice, again, I know Skip talked about it with equality and quantity, but that is also not just his theory. So if you can find all kinds of stuff out there of distributed practice. I did a video from Salt Lake Community College that really explains it well. So yeah, don't worry about stuff being from Skip versus not Skip, because most of the stuff he got from elsewhere. We should use it. Thanks, Elfie. So I think, let me see here, we are on to Jill for chapter 5.
All right, there you go. Yeah, so chapter 5 is focusing on time management and organization. So for the most part, I found it to be pretty similar to what we were used to doing, and it looked like the time management assignment was pretty similar. This is one of the lessons that I often tap into the staff at our tutoring center. And Lori Cordino happens to be one of the people on our campus, and I actually invite her to come into the class and talk about time management. And it's just nice for the kids to hear a different person, and it kind of ties in well with academic coaching, because that's something that she does with some of the students, talk about how to create study schedules and prioritizing and things like that. So one exercise that she always does with the kids, she actually brings in squares of paper, different color, blue, yellow, and green. And I believe the blue are the biggest, like a quarter sheet. The pink are like an eighth of a sheet, and then like a 16th of a sheet for the green. And every student gets a variety of the different sizes, and she has them write on it things that are important to them, that they prioritize with their day, use of their time. And if it's something that's really important, it gets the larger blue square. If it's something that's really small, not super important, but still on their list of priorities, it's on a smaller square. So they can have as many as they need, and they write one thing on each square. And then she gives everybody a piece of just a white paper, 8.5 by 11, just a Xerox piece of paper. And they have to fit all their squares on that paper. And of course, they never can, because some things are too big, so they have to rewrite it on a smaller sheet, or they try to overlap them, or they're hanging off the edge. And then the whole point is the 24-hour, the day that you have it represented by the white sheet. So if you're overlapping, that's like multitasking. And then we talk about, can you actually study and drive a car at the same time, commuting to work? And, that doesn't work. And if you're hanging over, that means you're extending past the 24-hour day. Do you rethink any of your size sheets? Are you going to get rid of some? Different things like that. So it's kind of a nice physical way for the students just to really think about it. So the book talks about the similar ideas of, creating priorities, and then putting things into your day in the right order. So, we've all seen those videos with the rocks in the jar, and, that's another great, I happen to show a video of it, but some people do it live in class, having students try to pack a jar with different materials. And of course, you have to put the big things in first, the most important things. So we talk a lot about, figuring out what are the big rocks. But I also, I was trying to find some ideas of some other types of class activities that would just be kind of fun to do. So these are some things that I came up with, that I came across that I thought were kind of interesting. So this first one, they call it 86,400. So just kind of a short version of the explanation. You tell kids they have this much money. You could do this as a group project or individually, and they have it to spend any way they wish, but you can't bank it. And if you don't use it, you lose it. So where would you put your money? How much? So then the idea then is 86,400 are the number of seconds you have each day. So again, just like you took the time to think about what is most important for you to do with the money, equate that to your time. What is the most important thing to do with your time? So just kind of a nice group activity with them. This was another one I thought was kind of fun. They call it list and priorities. But what you do is you put the students into groups of, they recommend 5 to 8, depending on your size class. But the students have this list of activities. So as a group, they're going to decide what they're going to do. And some are low points, some are really easy, low points, some are really easy, but higher points, some are a little harder, higher points, different things like that. So I thought it was kind of just a fun, if you're just looking for something to kind of break things up. But they have 10 minutes. And the goal is to earn as many points as you can. So, of course, there's going to be a lot of craziness if you look at some of these names, like singing a song, a lap around the room, paper airplanes, fun stuff like that. But you can see there's different point values. So the idea behind this then is, after the 10 minutes and you tally up the points, the idea then here, this debriefing is, how did the team decide what tasks to do? Did you go for things that were low time but high rewards? Did you go for lots of things that were lower rewards but easy to do? And kind of how did you prioritize what you were going to do to get the most points? And so I just thought that was, again, another interesting way. And of course, you can talk about group dynamics as well and how that may have influenced, because, working together in groups and something that students are going to have, in various classes. So you can kind of bring that into it as well. So I thought that was kind of an interesting activity. Another one is this one they call How Long is a Minute? Asking students at the beginning of class, they're going to close their eyes and they're supposed to open their eyes when they think 30 seconds is up. And then, of course, as the instructor, you can be watching and you see that everyone's going to open their eyes at a different time. Because we all have different perceptions of time. We think that, oh my gosh, I sat down and studied forever. Well, it was only 15 minutes, but for you, that felt like an eternity. If you want to do a physical variation, you could have them stand up and then sit down when they feel that the time, whether it be 30 seconds or a minute, is up. But then you also sort of add the element of peer pressure. Everyone else is sitting down, but I'm still standing, but I think it's still under time, or different things like that. So I thought that was kind of just, again, just more of a physical type of activity to demonstrate time and our perception of it. And then in terms of organization, this one was called Ace of Spades. If you have 2 volunteers, or if you have enough cards, you could probably do it with everybody in the class. But you give people, if you have 2 volunteers, they each get a deck of cards. And the idea is when you say go, they're supposed to find the Ace of Spades in the deck. The one deck is going to be in order, Ace, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to Jack by suit. So they just have to go through something in order. The other one's going to be all mixed up, even some cards backwards, upside down, every which way. The point of this being that organization is so key, that when you need to find something and things are in an order, it's a matter of seconds to find it. Where if your notebook is all unorganized, finding that really important study guide is going to take so much longer, but it's just a way to demonstrate how much longer and how much wasted time when things are not organized. So I thought that was kind of a great illustration as well. And then the other thing I added, 2 things that I like to do in the class. There's a great video, a TED Talk video by a guy named Tim Urban, Inside the Mind of a Master Procrastinator. It's about 14 minutes. He has a really lighthearted look at he admits he's quite a procrastinator and what goes through in his mind. And he has this whole idea of the panic monkey and the panic monster and, and all this stuff, and how how procrastination can influence people, and why without deadlines, you never kick into getting stuff done. So it's kind of a lighthearted work. It's very entertaining. Kids like it. It's kind of funny, but it just kind of sheds some light on procrastination. So I put that in there too. But that's another one that I like to share. So anyway, there's some ideas about it. I didn't do a whole lot with the chapter itself. It's very similar to what we have. There's some some good resources in the chapter with some ideas with the organization and things like that. So.
Thanks, Jill. I guess I would add a similar thought to what I expressed before. The quadrant system, if you like that, by all means keep teaching it, because again, the quadrant system was from Stephen Covey, not from Skip. So like Jill said, the topic or the material in the new book is very similar. But again, if you like that quadrant system from the old book, keep teaching. It wasn't Skip's, it was Stephen Covey. So, and we did revise the assignment to reflect the new book, but don't let go of that quadrant system if you like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then I think we're wrapping up with Connie for Personal and Financial Health, Chapter 11.
Okay, let me share my screen. Mine's very brief because this was kind of a short chapter. And it also went into like STDs and other things that I'm definitely not gonna cover unless I'm a phys ed, health and wellness high school teacher, then I might have to. But I was having personal flashbacks to high school sex ed, and it was not fun. So, so looking at the chapter, one of the things, I just have a graphic there that it kind of stresses at the beginning that, you know, just that your financial stress and personal stress, you know, all can relate to each other. So if you have financial stress, that can cause personal stress and things like that. And so how that kind of continuum works. So I just kind of included a graphic in there, and I'm trying to think of the exact, I probably should be at the chapter. I forget what page it starts on, but oh, it says, now think about the relationship between feelings of stress and your personal and financial health. If you're like many people, there's a clear connection between how stressed you are and how good you feel, and between how stressed you are and how well you manage your money. So I just thought that that was just an interesting graphic. And another graphic that might be a little bit hard to see, but you can find this online if you Google like social distancing and control. This was a good graphic that was going around on the internet, but like, again, it's hard to see right here, and I'm trying to see if I can do, I don't know if I can do control. If I can find the graphic online just to show you better. I don't know what it's bringing me there. I found it when I was in Google, I found it, but I'll just go back to not waste time. But it just says like, I cannot control the amount of toilet paper at the store, how long this will last, how others react, other people's motives, predicting what will happen, the actions of others if others follow the rules of social distancing. This is, you know, came out when everything first started. And it's like, I can't control, so I will focus on these things. And it says turning off the news, limiting my social media, finding fun things to do at home, my kindness and grace, my own social distancing, how I follow CDC recommendations, and my positive attitude. So I remember when this pandemic first started, just the feelings of stress, you know, especially the first 2 weeks, because we didn't really know a lot, and it was like very scary. Not that it's not still for some people, but what I'm saying is we didn't really know a lot, and we were very scared and like, what's going on? And then, you know, you were like, okay, if we knew in those first couple of weeks, if we social distance, we could help not overwhelm the healthcare system. So I think that was really the goal. And then you would see people who weren't social distancing and parties and wherever, and then you'd start freaking out like, oh no, this is going to cause us to have to be in this longer. And then I know for me, I was having a lot of personal stress because I was hearing about students losing jobs, and, you know, and as much as that bothers me, I can't control that though. So I think that this was just a timely graphic in relation to stress, but there's different ones we can put in there. And this was just another thing that the chapter talked about was just how stress affects the body and how it pretty much affects every area of our body. And we're probably well aware of that, but students aren't necessarily aware of that. So just talking about how that affects everything. And I think especially too, sleep is typically affected. But in the book, it said that higher grades are actually associated with, they did a study going to bed earlier and getting up earlier during the week and on weekends. And so I think that can talk about just setting a schedule. Like you need to have a routine, you need to have a schedule. And for some people, a lot of our students, and I can relate because I'm going back to school in the fall, is that, you know, how can you fit in school? Like, what are you going to do differently? Because you might have had work and kids and everything else before, and now you're adding school. So how is that even physically possible? So sometimes that means getting up an hour earlier every morning, right? Or getting up 2 hours earlier on the weekends because now you have this other commitment. So talking about that. And it also said, they also said regularly eating breakfast actually does correlate with good grades. So that was just something to note. And I think just from watching my own kids during this pandemic, because Christy and I are good personal friends, our kids are the same ages outside of school. So we were just texting that our kids are asleep, but my 3 boys just got up. But, you know, it's already 10:54 and no one has even came down the kitchen to eat anything because they're on their video games as soon as they wake up. So like they've already skipped breakfast. And so they're done with school. They finished last Friday, but me personally, I'm really big on like, you need to eat breakfast. It's really important. But during a pandemic, we just kind of let some things go. But what I'm saying is my point, I see that with them because, you know, if you're getting out of a routine, you're skipping certain things and it does affect other things. Another thing that the chapter really focused on was financial health, and they didn't really have a lot in the chapter, but I know that I really like to focus on this topic. And so I think I would probably still continue to bring in, you know, Fulton Bank, or just talk about that piece, because I know students really learn a lot talking about credit score and credit report. And I just budgeting resources. This is just a link to a US News article that had different apps and different resources for creating a budget. Because I know when I talk to students, when we do that 2-year credit, a lot of things they ask is about budgeting. Like, well, how do I budget? How do I even get started with budgeting? But the simple answer to that is, I mean, you can look online, because there's so many resources, and there's so many free apps, and you can even have students brainstorm that in class, because I know a lot of students actually are doing it, and they have tips for other students. For example, I had one student that, and I forget the name of the app, but she was saying that there's an app you can actually sign up for. It's free, and you can track like that you pay your rent, because rent doesn't raise your credit, but this app can track it, and it helps to raise your credit score. I didn't even know something like that existed. So there's just different cool things like that that you can learn from your students. I didn't put anything here, but just talking about credit score versus credit report. A lot of students don't even know that those are two different things, that your credit score is just a number, and your credit report is that long report that they should be checking, you know, at least once a year to make sure there's not errors on there. And I know for my students, we've been talking about that for years, and I often have students that will go home and check their credit report, and things on there are not right, which is why their credit score might be lower and they're not understanding. Like, for example, I had a student who was a junior, and their dad's information was on their credit report mistakenly. So they were able to get that corrected. So just discussing the difference between that, how they can check their credit report for free, you know, things you can do to raise your credit score. There in Lancaster specifically, there's a nonprofit organization called Tabor. It's in downtown Lancaster. And they actually provide like free credit counseling and budgeting and different resources. And they are like a nonprofit agency. So I always tell students, if you are looking to build your credit, or you want resources, you want to go to a place like Tabor where they're not making money off you. You know, you don't want to go to these credit repairing agencies, because those are all making money. So we talk a little bit about that. But there's, in every county, I'm sure there's organizations that do that. And then I also, when I'm talking about financial health, I always like to talk about and share the scholarships website through HACC, and just let students know that, you know, every semester for the following semester, they can apply for scholarships, and that, you know, taking 45 minutes to fill out a scholarship application might result in thousands of dollars of free money. So I always like to go over that one with them. So I think that that's important. And then we've been doing this. Most people have been doing this. I put just a link to the spending log that everybody has seen. I like that activity. I'm going to keep doing that. I typically will introduce that log the week before we talk about financial management, so they can log their spending for a week. And then this is just the one that I'm doing. I just included the one that I'm doing for my FS 102 class that just started last week. So if this is gonna, I don't know if this is gonna open. Let me see here. I might have to share my, let me see. I don't know if I shared it on here. I don't think I had it. It was on there. Let me see. The PowerPoint. Oh, it's not on there. Maybe we can't open it on there. It was on my. Well, I don't want to hold everybody up. So basically, it's an activity that it's basically a spending log reflection, and I changed the questions around kind of depending on what's going on. So one of the questions I did have them ask was, now that we've been in a pandemic, like, how have you saved money? Just a positive way to reflect on it. And so that was one of the questions, but various questions just about, like, did you notice, you know, what did you spend money on? What do you seem to, you know, waste money on? Because my personal philosophy is everybody has something they waste money on usually. So whether it's dining out, whether it's handbags, whether it's sneakers, whether everybody has like their vice of what they do. So reflecting on that. And then I don't know if you can open this. I do have it saved, I think, over here. I know. So Shelley Blanchette did this, originally designed this activity. I had it saved on my remote desktop, so I kind of had to do a quick thing. But what she does is, and I shared this with my FS 100 class when we were going remote, and my students were like, oh, that's really awesome, is basically it's like use the table to try to come up with at least 10 ways you could save $50 so that over the course of the year, you're saving $1,000. And so just coming up with examples. So like I typically spend $100 on each of my siblings for Christmas. I have 3. That's fake. I actually only have 1, but this year I'll commit to only spending $50 per sibling. So that would be $150 I would save that year. And then the goal is to try to save $1,000, but I came up with this other example, like eating out. Like a lot of students share with me, like if I go out to eat with my family, that's $50 with a tip. If we do that, and I normally do that twice a week, if I cut that down by only 1 week, and I was kind of boggled by that. I was like, wow, 1 less trip is $2,600, to dining out. Because so just thinking about those examples. And so the students just come up with ways, and then they put an asterisk by the ones they're actually going to do. And so this is kind of a cool activity. If you can't open it in the link that Heather sends out with the PowerPoint, you can let me know. But that's credits given to Shelley Blanchette for that. Let me see that. So yeah, so I give Shelley definitely has the credit for that one because she came up with that activity and shared it with me a while ago. So that's just another activity that I think is cool, that after their time or their spending log and they see what they were spending, they can do that brainstorm. So that is mine.
Thanks, Connie. And just so you know, the Fulton Bank option, I still use them. I still have Fulton Bank come in, but PSECU is also very willing to work with us as well. And I still use Fulton, but I subbed for someone who had PSECU come in, and their presentation I thought was really good as well. It's different, but it's also good. So keep that in mind. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. It was great to spend time with you today. And I'll prepare the recording and put on my YouTube channel and send out a link. And if you would mind sharing, if you had any slides or like your handout, Jill, or if you wouldn't mind sharing, if you can send that by email to me, that would be great. And I'll put all of this information in our FYS course resources shell. So thank you so much, everyone. It was great. Any
Thanks, Heather.
questions
Thank you,
or
Heather.
comments? Okay, well, I hope you all have a great day. I'm sure we'll be talking as the next several weeks continue and we see what's happening for this fall. We'll stay in touch.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.